Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's show. My name is Spencer Welsh. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We do appreciate it. Great to be back in action today. Got a very exciting show. We are talking today about the rail strike, looking at it by the numbers. We got to cover to you from all angles. We're going to tell you the truth about it. I titled the show "The Truth About the Oncoming Lockout Strike," whatever you want to call it, because, you know, if you've been listening at all in the mainstream media, you've most likely seen only one perspective. That's the perspective of the presidential board, the Republicans, and the railway companies. Well, we're going to give you it straight from the workers' mouth. We're going to tell you why they are pissed off tonight, and kind of get you understanding of what is going on. So yeah, we're taking a look by the numbers. What is going on, what is at stake here, really the right to strike in these kind of disputes, really as a first place, looking also at how it plays out in other countries and what Bernie Sanders has been doing to stop it. Also, some just kind of miscellaneous stuff we're going to get to as well. Got full coverage of that railway labor dispute for you. Also on the show today, we're talking about the Fed's plans to trigger a recession. We've been warning about this on the show for quite some time, but you know, it's been really kind of one of the things I've been harping on lately. It looks like that plan is continuing apace. How can we stop it? Branko Marcetic-Jacobin has some ideas. Also, the strike that started the red wave 10 years ago today, or a few days ago, Chicago teachers walked off the job. We'll take a look at the effects that had on the labor movement coinciding from it. We're starting at the top today, though, with America's largest railroads. They've transformed into a once-stayed industry, into a profit-generating machine on par with the world's richest technology companies, even as they drove down conditions for the tens of thousands of workers they employ. You know, I think, you know, even there, I would kind of quarrel with, because that is how they did it. You know, it's clear to see they drove, or, you know, just kept the standards, shaved off a little bit of the standards each year. More Perfect Union broke down the financial filings of major U.S. railroads and finding their windfall profits have come at the direct expense of their workforce. In the past 2 decades, operating profit margins have nearly tripled for the major carriers, while the percentage of revenue they spent on labor sunk by double digits. You know, that is something that, you know, that's just pay. You know, we're not talking about the fact that if they go to the doctor for their yearly physical, there's a very good chance they're going to be fired. The people that, you know, you're going to hear are kind of, like, you know, very selfish and threatening the economy and all this. You know, the amount, the level of degree of which is being talked about, you know, by some very serious people is quite alarming. But, you know, we will get to that. So tens of thousands of American railway workers have gone 3 years without a raise amid a contract dispute with the major carriers. The industry has rejected their calls for sick leave, guaranteed time off, and a range of other improvements, even as their profit margins swell. Because it's not about, you know, it's not about a case where, like, oh, we need to, the pandemic's been tough on all of us, you know, we need to cut the cost. Like, no, they are saying this as the mounds of money around them just get taller and taller and taller. You know, they are making this conscious choice as they see their profits continue to increase with no signs of going away. You know, it's just, they got fat stacks at this point. And they're making that conscious decision to say, you know what, here's what we're going to do. We are not giving you, you know, any money. We're going to make your standards way below even the average job. You know, we're going to not only just keep you stagnant in an inflationary economy, we're going to move you backwards. That's what Americans, you know, leading freight carriers have been doing here. They're CSX, KC Southern, Norfolk Southern, and Union Pacific. Earning average operating margins of about 15%. This was back in 2001. That means after all their accounting for all their costs associated with running a railroad, including money spent on compensation and benefits, for every $100 of revenue, investors were left with $15 of profit. Now that number is 41, all while spending less each year on labor. As you know, inflation. I don't know if you've heard about this, guys, but inflation is going up. During that same period, the percentage of revenue spent on labor, you know, saw a sudden and drastic decline here. In 2001, the railroad spent $8.7 billion on compensation to generate $256 billion. In 2021, the companies spent 10% more on labor, but bought in nearly double the amount of revenue. It's insane to think about, said Matt Rustle, a popular investing commentator and transportation analyst. He said earlier this year. So there's 10% total spent on inflation, on over the course of 20 plus years, 10% more. I apologize. They didn't exactly go backwards, but they actually, in real terms, they definitely did go backwards. But technically, and more technology and more efficient diesel engines have made the rail industry more efficient, but the reduction in headcount has had an outsized impact on operating profit margins. According to the Presidential Emergency Board that analyzed the dispute, the carriers maintain that capital investment and risk are the reasons for their profit, not any contributions by labor. As the graph below demonstrates, there's a clear inverse relationship between the company's profit margin relative to the amount it spends on labor. As you can see, labor, the clear inverse relationship between as the operating margin, income margin goes up. Now it's just about 40. Profit margin goes up. The amount of spending on labor goes down. So, ergo, spending less on labor increases profit. The revolution can be traced back to executive Hunter Harrison, who pioneered what's commonly referred to as a precision scheduling business model based on longer trains and fewer workers. In 2000, Union Pacific employed about 50,000 people and generated $11.8 billion. Today, Union Pacific employs about 18,000 less people and manages to earn 85% more in revenue each year. The situation is common among the industry. Trains that were once staffed with 5 workers are now staffed with 2, and carriers hope to cut that to 1 worker on a whole train. Workers themselves are now caught in constant flux. Nearly all employees are on call virtually around the clock, expected to report to work within 90 minutes for shifts that can last nearly 80 hours. That does not include the time you're sitting at the away-from-home terminal, said railway worker Michael Paul Lindsay. You may be away from home subject to the railroad, not with your family, for 120 hours in a week. The data suggests that the money once spent on fully staffing locomotives is now spent on enriching shareholders through dividend payments and stock repurchases. Because, it's not about, making the railways better, not treating the people, not improving the lives of the workers, not even a smidge, that they feel like they need to just throw off and give to the workers, because nobody pays attention to them. Nobody cares. And this is the power of organized labor. You've seen it right here. It may be probably one of the most weakest, poorly run unions in the sector. They're divided. They can't get any kind of, serious demands. They really buddied up way too close to the Democratic Party. Jonah Furman has a thread that we'll go to on this a little bit later on. But it just shows you, even then, the fact that they are organized, it means that they're able to have this dispute and they have a fighting chance in being able to change their circumstances because they are unified together. So in the past, most rail executives at the 4 surveyed railroads rewarded investors with modest yearly dividends. In 2009, the rail industry's operating margins overtook what companies spent on wages and benefits relative to revenue. The shift had a massive impact on how much profit the firms made and, obviously, how executives decided to manage the company. From 2001 to 2009, the 4 rail firms spent $17 billion in dividend programs and stock repurchases. In the 8 years after the inflection point, that amount increases 4.5 times. Share repurchases, the practice of stock buybacks, the using profits to buy companies' stock and boost its price was once effectively non-existent. Today, management regularly spends upwards of $10 billion a year on share repurchases. Starting in 2010, the 4 companies have delivered nearly $124 billion to shareholders in dividends and stock repurchases. During that time, all American railroads have paid out a staggering $196 billion. BNSF, which is the largest carrier by 2021 revenue, is not immune from the trends. The railway, which is owned by, the friendly billionaire everyone loves, Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway, recently embraced precision scheduling. This year, the company posted the best operating margin in at least 21 years. While the percentage of revenue spent on labor fell to its lowest. As part of the operational makeover, the company introduced a draconian point-based attendance system in which workers are getting just 1 day off each month. So America's major freight railroads began halting shipments and snarling the supply chain on Monday in an effort to pressure the Congress to impose a labor contract that's friendly to the industry. If no agreement is reached by Thursday, railroads will be legally authorized to lock out workers, and railroads will be legally able to authorize a strike. Either action will have severe consequences for the U.S. supply chains. I've never seen them disregard their employees like this, as Dennis Pierce, president of the one of the largest rail unions, BLET. Yeah, well, you better believe it, bud, and do something about it, because it's starting to be a bit of a problem. I've never seen them treat them this bad in the workplace, and I've never seen them this adamant at the bargaining table that they want everything. And that's a great way of putting it. They want everything. They are not, they, even if they see the stacks of money around them soaring constantly, they are not willing to say, you know what, I'll sit down, I'll take a break, it's not a big deal. Yeah, it's like, it's just unbelievable what they feel comfortable just saying, doing, and what they think, and really what many in an administration, and it's going to be interesting to see here what Joe Biden really does and what he can do. We've seen what his presidential emergency board has done with the contract, which is pretty much say, yeah, sick days, who needs them? But it is still going to be very interesting to see how how the wheels of state turn to try and crush this movement, and how successful they end up being. We're going to follow that for you very closely, and let's take another angle of this. This is in Labor Notes today. For months, 125 union railroad workers have been stuck at an impasse with their employers, who are united under the banner of the Association of American Railroads. So they are the employers. They are united. They form kind of one single cohesive industrial kind of unit, which is, as we're going to see, beneficial. The terms of the dispute should be familiar to most workers: attendance policy, staffing, and wage increases. Despite record profits, rail employers have cut staffing, placing enormous burdens on workers that aren't reflected in the pay. By all accounts, rail workers are in a pretty militant mood. Attendance policy prompted rail unions to attempt to strike earlier this year. In July, about 99% of union members who cast their ballots voted to authorize another strike, prompting Joe Biden to intervene in August. In order to avert a strike, Biden appointed a presidential emergency board to reach a compromise and settle the dispute. The PEB put some money into wages, but predictably did little on the workers' core workplace concerns, quality of life issues that make their lives just better. The rail unions are unenthusiastic about the PEB ruling, and the largest groups have not been willing to put the recommendation out for membership ratification. While the bargaining continues, the unions will be eligible to strike on September 16th. Again, this Friday, which is 30 days following the PEB recommendation. That eligibility requirement is a term of the Railway Labor Act passed back in 1926, which regulates bargaining in rail and airline industries. Even though the Rail Labor Act, the RLA, protects the right to strike in words, politicians of both parties have used the legislation to strip railroad workers of that right in practice, often ramming settlements down the throats of striking workers. So they can, which is, it is kind of tough. How will the unions kind of respond? Over the years, the Congress have intervened several times to delay strikes and sometimes even impose terms on railroad workers. Harry Truman threatened to have the Army run the railroads in 1950 during the Korean War. In the 1960s, President Johnson imposed a longer no strike period on rail workers. Obama delayed a strike back in 2011. Just hours into the last major rail strike, Congress passed legislation imposing the very contract workers rejected. The legislation required further bargaining, but held that if no agreement was reached, the terms of the PEB would be implemented, even though the unions had already rejected those terms. So that is something that we could very easily see happening. And Republicans and nearly all Democrats lined up to take away workers' rights back in 1991. The final vote was 400-5. The controversy created widespread disaffection with the Democratic Party, even spurring the Brotherhood of Maintenance of Way employees to endorse the Labor Party advocates, which was the last serious attempt to create a Labor Party in the U.S. Technically speaking, the RLA doesn't revoke the right to strike, only restricts the timing of the strikes. Nevertheless, it has been used time and time again to diffuse militancy and limit strike activity. The legislation was a subject of vigorous debate in the 1920s. Even the conservative rail unions, the epitome of business unionism, opposed taking away the right to strike, though they ended up supporting the legislation anyway. There were several attempts prior to 1926 to completely eliminate rail workers' right to strike, but none passed Congress. Given the futility of attempting to pass legislation for compulsory arbitration, the pro-labor Minnesota representative William Carrs explained that anti-labor legislation needed to be more subtle. Carrs observed that no state political party will ever pass a law to compel an American citizen to work against his will. Employer representatives had to content themselves with legislating a lengthy process that would make strikes unlikely, a stance they rationalized with reference to the necessity of rail freight to the economy. So, fast forward to a century, no such subtlety is required. Many in Congress believe it's completely acceptable to strip railroad workers the right to strike, and it's incumbent on us to defend it. And us, it's a very kind of complex, whatever the left is today, to really put that pressure on. And it's going to be, Congress that goes through here at some point. And Congress, it can't just be Bernie, as we're going to get to. It really can't, because we got to have, a little bit more in the tank than, just that. As much as important as Bernie is to the movement, you got united a huge chunk of the Democratic Party is going to actually go out in the media. And the unions need to actually have a role in this, too. It is their fight as well. They can't just... this is going to be a really interesting example of, will the Democratic Party be able to link up with organized labor in a very, very key and critical moment for the industry? This is a key industry, for sure, that is very, very key works, and the workers actually hold a lot of power here. Will they be able to organize enough to be efficient in how they reach out and move with the Democratic Party? Because they have not been very effective in the past. I'm going to pull up this, see if I can find this Jonah Furman thread here. Really good thread I was reading just before this. So he responding to a guy named Jeff Shirky, who is in these times and Jacobin writer. A very, very good writer. We're going to do an In These Times story in just a little bit. He writes that a lot of people calling on the Biden administration to step in, but it needs to be stated the Biden administration already stepped in 2 months ago by appointing a presidential emergency board, which totally dropped the ball. And Jonah Furman of Labor Notes, another great website that we've just read that story from, said this is the most damning thing. The entire rail union strategy was wait till the Democrats are in charge, they'll get us a good deal. And then the Democrats came up with a deal that 80% of the rail workers can't live with. And, to a certain extent, it can't just be the Democrats are who the Democrats are to a certain extent. It has to be incumbent on the labor union to be a little bit smarter in the situation. There, we said they're epitome of business unionism. This is exactly the downside of this here. They have staked their political power on the Democrats are going to be within the union as, the Democrats aren't going to do us wrong. It's going to be all right. And that's a big reason why they won't even take this agreement to the parties, because they can't come out, right away and say, the Democrats, they didn't give us a good deal here. This is just pretty embarrassing. But now there's nowhere left, he says, but the picket line. And precisely because the rail union leadership strategy was hope the Dems get us a good deal, they're in a totally deferential relationship to the party, especially with the midterms coming up. Their strategy was to buddy up to them, so they can't now outright say, man, the Dems blew it, let alone do something like build a meaningful contingency of Congress people to support emergency federal legislation to grant workers 15 paid sick days. Instead, they Bernie's unrelenting pro-worker willingness to buck the party, as we'll get to in a second, and no other plan. And because the rail unions are divided up to 14 unions in 8 IUs, I think it's international unions, in 2 bargaining coalitions ratified conflicting deals, there's no one who can credibly say this is what the rail workers need. Even the pro-union electeds are scared to piss off with someone off with any one demand. Some of this is by design because of how, again, the Railway Labor Act works. We just talked about that. And then there's a lot about, the philosophy of business unionism. I'll get mine. I'm going to get my union in there, get the best deal for my guys. And that always fails because you got to be, if there's other people in that industry, it's just going to work. It's just not going to work. It's just going to be very, very ineffective. yeah. So, and maybe a handful of people shouldn't own things that can disrupt our entire supply chain. That is a very good point. So, this is 8 hours ago today. This BNSF is a railroad company owned by Warren Buffett, the friendly billionaire. Love that. Has sent this letter to Congress urging them to pass legislation that would force rail workers to adopt a contract that contains 0 paid or unpaid sick days. In the letter, BNSF continues to lie about the sick leave policy. And there's no, how is the community? It's not just incumbent on the Democratic Party. There has to be an organized labor movement reaching out. They're not just going to come asking. Some of them should, if they're worth their salt. If they are who they say they are, but they have to. It's just it's so disheartening to see this kind of lack of communication to such a high degree. And a lot of these stories are sympathetic, but it's just like, it's early on. The message, I think over the next few days, we'll get out there a lot more, but it is a little bit disturbing in the first place. Bernie Sanders, though, he is killing it. If you were James Foote, the CEO of the CSX Rail Company, you'll make $20 million in total compensation. If you're a worker in the rail yards working for CSX, you know how many paid sick days you're entitled to? 0. Totally unacceptable. Bernie coming in with the messaging there on Twitter. And using his Senate power as well. On Wednesday afternoon, he stood up to, this is in Common Dreams here, he stood up to against a Republican's attempt to force 115,000 railroad workers to accept a contract recommended by a presidential board last month, saying the GOP wants to hinder workers' fight for sick leave and better working conditions. For taking to the Senate floor, Sanders tweeted, "I will proudly stand up to stop the legislation proposed by Roger Wicker and Richard Burr, the Republican senators from Mississippi and North Carolina." The Presidential Emergency Board was a nonpartisan panel appointed by President Joe Biden last month, recommending the rail carriers and union workers accept a contract with wage increases, but unions expressed outrage because obviously there was no sick days, and there was a strict points-based attendance policy which requires engineers and conductors to work many days, sometimes consecutive weeks or months with no time off, to make up for just taking off a weekend. A weekend. When I said they work for the whole month, I'm talking about weekends too. If you're on the rail, you're going to be gone for a long time. You don't necessarily, these people have families. It's just, you can put 2 and 2 together there. It is just a really, really awful situation. Democrats are not going to impose these contracts without dealing with the issue of workers' working lives. Larry Cohen, former president of the CWA, told Communication Workers Union, told Washington Post, Republicans are viciously against collective bargaining, but carriers are going to have to respect people's lives, and there's going to have to be respect for these workers. They're not going to get a settlement without it. And on the Senate floor, Sanders condemned the rail industry for trying to pressure workers into accepting working conditions, which he called absolutely unacceptable. He kind of went all on it. He blocked that original legislation, something kind of to be expected, but it is still good to see. At least there is somebody out there. We'll see how strong it is in the House, this kind of willingness to stand up, but I think this should be an issue that is just, if there's anything, if there's a reason why these people are in these elected positions, it's, it goes both ways. It's coming on, I think, the unions to be organized, but it goes both ways. Like, they have to have some sort of response to that, some sort of way to stand up and say that, here's what we want, and then, there has to be a receptive audience. If they're worth their salt, this is what they're there for, in Congress, to be receptive to workers' demands, to be their allies, especially some of the people who say, "Oh, I'm a DSA endorser." Like, I don't know if Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez still calls herself a member of the DSA, but she, that is what I think she is there for. Plain and simple. It's not to do GQ interviews. I'll say that much. All right, let's go on to Bernie here on the Senate floor. See what he has to say. All right, we're going to get Bernie. This is a bit of a long speech here, but...
Just a correction of the record. I think Senator Wicker mentioned before that a number of unions had approved this agreement. As I think everybody knows, there cannot be an approval of a union agreement unless the workers themselves vote on it. They have not voted on it. So, in fact, there has been no approval by any union of the agreement. But before I go to the rail situation, I did want to say a few words and put this issue into a broader context, and then I'll get to the rail situation. As I think most Americans know, today we have more income and wealth inequality than any time in the history of our country. People on top are doing phenomenally well, while working people are struggling to keep their heads above water. During the pandemic, while essential workers like those employed at the railroads, while these people put their lives on the line and died by the thousands, the billionaire class, the people on top, saw a $2 trillion increase in their wealth. Workers died by the tens of thousands. People on top became much richer.
There you have Bernie in stark terms reminding the Senate, an empty Senate, obviously you've seen those videos, how what the situation is, what the state of things really is. But it's gonna take more than him in the government. All right. Up next, let's go here to Jacobin and Branko Marcetic about the Fed here. He writes, by all accounts, things are looking up for the Democrats. Gasoline prices are falling. The president's approval rating is up. The White House is on a bit of a legislative roll. And the right's overreach on abortion rights and Donald Trump's possible indictment have generated a genuine voter backlash against the GOP just in time for the midterms. With wind at their sails, it seems like nothing will stop the party's momentum. Nothing except a Fed-induced recession. And we've been talking about this for a long time. It's been kind of pretty easy to see coming with all this, fear-mongering about inflation rates and inflation rates going up. That is not fear-mongering. But some of the really misleading stuff we're seeing about, wage price spiral and this refusal to ignore some of the biggest costs of this really awful, skyrocketing inflation that we're seeing, even just over the course of the last month, which is, frankly, it is, the supply chain situation. We got, war in Ukraine putting huge prices on huge problems and influence on oil. And, this method here, what the Fed is trying to do is they are trying to raise interest rates with the goal of tightening up the labor market. And that's going to really lead to a big increase in unemployment. And it's something that, for the most part, judging what we know about, just knowing what we know, taking a really just basic, realistic look on the way inflation is today, it's not going to have a major effect on inflation because we know what the causes of inflation are. They're staring at us right in the face, but there is a huge movement by some of the most powerful people who essentially run the economy in all these key industries that we've been doing stories about. Different people, some people, Wall Street traders, some people who, all the people essentially would stand to benefit from a tight labor market, people forced to go back from work, working class with less options, has been really pretty clear. They want to see the Fed do this. He says, Fed Chair Jerome Powell told the libertarian think tank, the Cato Institute, I can assure you that my colleagues and I are strongly committed to the project, and we will keep at it until the job is done. Because based on what I know today, I support a significant increase at our next meeting to get the policy rate to a setting that is clearly restricting demand. Again, what demand? The problem is people need stuff. The demand is there, but the prices are too damn high. This is a price crisis. Nowhere else is it being treated like some sort of, inflationary crisis where the working class pockets are, too swell. The spending is just too much. It's just not being treated like that anywhere else, because it's just not the reality. Like, there isn't just a toxic culture of just libertarian policy and just discredited neoliberal policy. The desire to just do the 1980s all over again. It is really, really clear that he's committed. He's committed to it. This is Christopher Waller, who said he wants a policy increase. He's one of the governors of the Federal Reserve Board, said that this past Friday. Lael Brainerd, the Fed's vice chair, getting that Lael Brainerd had told a finance industry gathering the monetary policy will need to be restricted for some time, and said that we are in this for as long as it takes to get inflation down. So when you lose your job in the midterms, just know, if you're a worker out there, inflation will go down. It's going to get better, All that power you're losing, that sucking sound that you're hearing, the sound of all your power, all the bargaining power that was really in vogue after the pandemic, the ability, all the, the labor shortage crap that we've been hearing so much about, that sound of you losing your power, that's just going to bring inflation down. So you should be happy. Anyway, we are going to take a quick break and get to our last story in just 49 seconds.
My name is Spencer Walsh. This is the Spencer Walsh Radio Network, and if you're listening to one of our podcasts, whether it's Newsflash, Hidden History, The Spencer Walsh Show, or something else, ladies and gentlemen, we have one simple request of you. Please be sure to rate us, subscribe to us if you like us, and leave us a comment, because just like all of you, sometimes we need that feedback in our lives, good or bad. We want to hear what you have to say. So please do those steps. Make SWR and content better. And thank you so much for listening.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are now going to move on to our last story. And, I don't know what the saying is, when do people decide, history, when do people decide, what counts as history? When do historians say? I think it's 10 to 15 years. Well, I think just recently, 3 days ago, this major event in labor history officially entered, historian history as well. It is the Chicago teachers' strike. And I think it's probably still, was going on 10 years ago today. Really, really cool stuff. But this is an account here from one of the people who organized it, Jackson Potter, talking about what it meant. Because it was a really, really big moment, just kind of after the huge, huge hit to unions that was taken. I think they were just absolutely at their lowest in the, 2009 to 2012 period. And this is the kind of beginning of, a very, very effective, well-run strike, well-run campaign. And this is, it was a story about here kind of the teachers who really let it off. So this is what Jackson had to say. After facing 30 years of corporate education reform that demonized teachers and led to massive privatization of public schools across the U.S., teachers everywhere were ready to fight back. For many of us in Chicago ahead of the 2012 strike, political developments have shown a range of possibilities for what fighting back could look like. We'd recently watched intently as protesters overtook plazas in Tahrir Square to demand the overthrow of Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, as well as the crowds occupying the Washington State House to oppose Republican Governor Scott Walker's Anti-Union Act 10. In Chicago, resistance to the attacks on teachers required us to defeat one of the most powerful Democratic politicians in the country, then Mayor Rahm Emanuel, and endure the largest closing of black schools in U.S. history, and roar back from the brink of an effort to dismantle public education as we know it. But today, 10 years after the historic 2012 strike, we've seen the educational justice movement mature and become stronger through a decade of struggle. The 2012 Chicago Teachers Union, CTU, strike is often referenced to as inspiration for an approach to contract negotiations called bargaining for the common good, where unions make demands that would benefit not just members but the larger communities they engage with. For example, the teachers called for an end to privatization and austerity policies that affect working people, despite being legally restricted on what issues they could bargain over. And during contract negotiations in 2015, the CTU made proposals to pay $15 an hour to all school district employees, even those outside their own membership. That's called real solidarity. That's bargaining for the common good. Just a power-building, effective strategy that is just, really, really cool to see, in my opinion. Stephen Lerner, a senior fellow at the BCG Network and architect of the SEIU's Justice for Janitors campaign, has pointed the CTU's 2019 demand for affordable housing for all of Chicago's 20,000 homeless students as emblematic of how the labor movement needs to call for what was previously considered outside of the domain of traditional models of collective bargaining. According to labor historian Joseph McCartan, the former president of the Massachusetts Teachers Association, Marie Najimy, the new approach, and Marie Najimy, former president of the Massachusetts Teachers Association, the new approach has been adopted by teacher union locals who understood there was no way to confront the dynamics of austerity and especially its devastating impact on our most vulnerable communities unless workers in those communities joined together around a shared analysis to advance common goals. As a result of the success by teacher unions in advancing the social justice in their bargaining, unions outside of education have begun to embrace this strategy as well, which has actually turned out to be quite effective in its own right. In 2010, 4,000 Minnesota janitors from the SEIU Local 26 led a strike that focused in large part on environmental justice demands. As reported in The Forge, the demands included the creation of an owner and community green table, closure of a HERC incinerator, major source of both greenhouse gases and air pollution that harms nearby communities of color, and adoption of the union's proposed green cleaning program. A large part of the advance of social justice unionism over the last 10 years has been the use of internal organizing tools to cohere member sentiment around non-traditional demands. For example, in the years leading up to the 2019 strike, the United Teachers Los Angeles organization held thousands of conversations in person, on the phone, at rallies, in groups, and one-on-one with members, allies, and parents through a coordinated contract campaign against 40,000-plus membership. The union built broad consensus around demands that would impact both on the inside and outside of the classrooms, and on many fronts, they saw major victories. No fewer than 20 strikes in the past 10 years have injected hope and momentum into the labor movement's landscape, especially with education, and virtually all of them have adopted a pretty social justice framework. From Arizona to West Virginia, teachers have waged strikes that have led to unprecedented victories in school investment, class sizes, staffing formulas, and common good demands after decades of underfunding, privatization, and demonization of public school teachers and staff. Because the way that this, we saw with the railroad, they were organized. The rich are organized. They have their demands, and they carry them out ruthlessly by the control that they're able to exact over power and the levers of government. This is such a different situation. It's so cool to see because, this is unions and organized labor sticking up for, not just their individual union or anything like that. They're sticking up for the world, sticking up for the environment, they're sticking up for their communities, and that is just the way to do it. That's just how, in my opinion, good things continue to keep happening. And on that note, that is all the time we have for today. I'll probably be back on the air tomorrow, so it'll be very fun. See you then. It's been Newsflash.